Hello, my name is James Nagy. Thank you for watching my video series, The End of the End Times. This is part 3 of my presentation, which is a 10-part series based upon my book, also titled The End of the End Times. In this lesson, we're going to be looking into the events surrounding the ancient nation of Israel as it relates to the ancient Babylonian Empire. Now, in the book of Daniel, we have a description of four beasts, and biblical historians agree pretty much as to the identity of who these beasts are. The first beast that's mentioned, this is from Daniel chapter 7, verse 4. The first beast is described as follows. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. Again, this is from Daniel chapter 7, verse 4. Now, Daniel, in his vision of his first beast, is describing the ancient Babylonian Empire. And this would be a good time to remind you, I mentioned in the last presentation that if you haven't done so already, I would strongly encourage you to go to my website, theendoftheendtimes.com, and print out the maps and the timelines, because we're going to be referring to those extensively throughout this 10-part series. This is the same map. We're going to look at a map and a timeline here. And the same timeline and map that I'm using for this Babylonian presentation was also used when we talked about Assyria last time. Now I want to mention a couple things here because I went through the timeline rather quickly last time. Recall that the ancient nation of Israel broke apart into the nations of Israel, which became the northern empire, or the northern kingdom rather, of Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was then thereafter referred to as Judah. This occurred in 931 BC during the reign of King Rehoboam, king of Israel. So we see 2 timelines here for Israel and Judah. We also have 2 additional timelines for Babylon and Assyria. So right now, where we are currently right now, is Assyria is the prevailing empire of the entire region of the Mediterranean that includes the nation of Judah. Recall from last time that the Assyrian Empire assaulted the northern 10 tribes of Israel and took them into Assyrian captivity, and this occurred in 722 BC. You can see in the very top timeline. We're going to see in this lesson that the southern kingdom of Judah would undergo a similar fate, but not at the hands of Assyria, but rather at the hands of the Babylonian Empire. And this deportation or exile occurred in 586 BC. The next 2 timelines are Babylon and Assyria. As I said, right now, Assyria is the empire. We're going to see how and why Assyria falls as an empire in 612 BC, and how Babylon goes on to become the prevailing empire of that entire region of the world. Now I'm going to go over some key dates here. I'm going to try to present here a contiguous timeline of events that start out with the Assyrian Empire, ultimately lead to its defeat, and then going into the Babylonian Empire and the events ultimately leading to its defeat. Because while it's important to understand the individual empires that existed throughout Israel's history, I think it's very nice and very important to kind of have a understanding of the chronology, the time flow, the events that cause things to transition, how we get from one empire to the next, and how these events shaped the ancient nation of Israel. So, in 627 BC, Assyria is the prevailing empire, but Babylon declares its independence from Assyria. 2 years later, the Chaldean dynasty is established, and Nabopolassar becomes its first king. Some years later, in 612 BC, Babylon and the nation of Media, you can see where Media is here in the map. Its principal city is Ecbatana. So Babylon and Media join forces and engage in an assault on Assyria, and the principal Assyrian city of Nineveh is destroyed. In 607 BC, this date is very important, Babylon invades Judah during the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, and the Jewish nation becomes a vassal state. So in 607 BC, for all intents and purposes, Judah falls to Babylon and starts to serve Babylon as its king. A few years later, 586 BC, Jerusalem is completely surrounded by Babylonian armies, and the city falls, and the entire nation is deported to Babylon, except for a few poor people living in the land. Now, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, but like I said, I'm trying to present a contiguous timeline of events. So what happens several years later? In 559 BC, Cyrus the Great becomes ruler of Persia. Elam, you can see Elam in the map here. It's just a little bit east of the city of Babylon. So Elam, or Persia, defeats Media, and the nation of Media is absorbed into the nation of Elam. This becomes the birth of the Medo-Persian Empire. And this is the focus of the next lesson next time. So if you're not following all the specifics, that's okay. Just hold off until the next lesson. Now in 538 BC, Persia defeats Babylon, and this is critical to this lesson. We're going to see how and why Babylon, we're going to see both how Babylon rises as an empire and how it falls as an empire. Finally, in 537 BC, Cyrus the Great allows all of the Jews to return to Israel in fulfillment of all the Old Testament Bible prophecies discussing the restoration of the people of Israel and the restoration of the nation. Well, let's talk about Babylon a little bit. So after Babylon and Media defeat Assyria, so now Babylon is the prevailing empire of the region. So let's talk about them a little bit. Who are the Babylonians? So the Babylonians of the Chaldean dynasty specifically were a very religious people and very devoted to their gods. They had city gods and country gods that they believed, inhabited particular regions of their land. They were polytheistic, and they believed that everything possessed a spirit. Bel was one of their gods, Bel, B-E-L, who brought forth rain and floods. Nebo was the announcer god who was endowed with wisdom and the ability to prolong the years of a man. Now, over time, the Babylonians consolidated all of their gods under a central god that they called Marduk, and he became their chief god. Now, we can see in the Old Testament, we can see the root words of some of their gods in the names of the Babylonian leaders that appear throughout the Old Testament. For example, we have Nabopolassar, Evil-Merodach, Belshazzar. Well, these kings, these Babylonian kings, are taking their names from some of the Babylonian gods, Nabu, Marduk, and Bel. All right, so now Babylon has asserted itself as the prevailing empire. Let's talk about the decline of Judah and how Judah and the Babylonian Empire interact to ultimately lead to the destruction of Jerusalem. We have a king Manasseh. He becomes king of Judah when he was 12 years old, and he was the grandfather of one Josiah, who would go on to be the last righteous king of Judah. Manasseh led Judah into sin by rebuilding the high places to other gods, erecting altars to Baal, allowing the worship of Asherah, worshiping the starry host, building altars in the temple to other gods, and shedding innocent blood. And because of all of this, the Lord was determined to bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. This is a quote from 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 12. Well, Josiah, as I said, is going to go on to become the last righteous king of Judah. So Josiah is 8 years old when he becomes king, and this is in 640 BC, and he reigns for 31 years. When Josiah became king, the book of the covenant, or the book of the law, had been lost for almost 50 years. That means the people had not been hearing the word of God for 50 years, 5 decades. So Josiah, upon discovering the book of the law, or the covenant, immediately initiates his reforms. He reads the book of the covenant to all of the people in Jerusalem. He renews the covenant with the Lord. He removes from the temple, the articles belonging to the worship of Baal and Asherah. he removes the high places that were built for Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and then finally he reinstates the Passover. So he turns the nation on the right path. Unfortunately, by this time in Judah's history, the Lord was already committed to the destruction of Judah and to the city Jerusalem, and the rejection of the temple because of the sins of the previous kings. This is from 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 26 and 27. This slide is just here as kind of a reference slide to refer back to. It can be a little bit confusing reading Kings or Chronicles, trying to make sense out of the timeline of the kings, but it looks something like this. Josiah is the last righteous king of Israel. His son Jehoahaz becomes king. He's an unrighteous king. And then finally we have a succession of kings, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, who surrenders Jerusalem to Babylon. Now Jehoiakim is going to become important because it's through him that the Davidic line of kings is going to continue. And then Zedekiah, who's the son of Josiah, rebels against Babylon. And then finally in 586 BC, the city of Jerusalem falls. So like I said, the slide here is really just kind of a reference slide to refer back to when, as you read through the prophets or some of the historical books of the Old Testament, so you can kind of see the chronology of the kings. Well, during the time that Babylon, or the Babylonian Empire, was assaulting Judah, there are several deportations to Babylon. And these deportations are important. In 607 BC, Egypt falls to Nebuchadnezzar, and this effectively brings Judah under Babylonian control. So in 607 BC, that's kind of our starting point where Judah is effectively serving Babylon. In 605 BC, 2 years later, captives are taken from Jerusalem back to Babylon. This includes the prophet Daniel. This is from 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 6 and 7. In 597 BC, King Jehoiakim is taken to Babylon along with the royal family and 10,000 other captives, including the prophet Ezekiel. So Zedekiah, this is Jehoiakim's uncle, he is the final king to rule over Judah. Now the prophet Jeremiah had been instructing Zedekiah to yield to the Babylonian ruler. This is from Jeremiah chapter 27, verse 12. And Jeremiah is informing the king that it was neither God's will nor Nebuchadnezzar's desire to completely destroy the nation. So neither God nor the Babylonian king wanted to destroy Judah. Simply God is judging the nation using Babylon to do it, and the intent of God was not to completely destroy the nation. But unfortunately, Zedekiah rebels against Babylon, and Jerusalem is completely destroyed in 586 BC. We have, at this time, more captives taken to Babylon. An important point, now, as of 586 BC, only the poorest people are left in the land. Jerusalem and the principal cities of Judah are destroyed. A very important point, as we'll see a couple slides from now. We're now going to look into the events surrounding 3 of the prophets of Judah. So you remember from last time I mentioned that whenever the nation of either Israel or Judah was falling into sin, into moral depravity, the Lord would then send prophets. And if we look at the timelines of the kings and the prophets, we see several clusters of prophets. We have a cluster of prophets right about the time of the Babylonian captivity of Judah in 586 BC. These are Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. There's other prophets as well, but we're going to look into some of the events surrounding these 3 prophets. The first one we're going to look at is Jeremiah. I consider Jeremiah to be the ambassador to Jerusalem. Why? Well, when all this is going on, all this destruction, Jeremiah is living in Jerusalem from the time of King Josiah until the fall of the city in 586 BC. Jeremiah would go on to become the Lord's mouthpiece to the inhabitants of Judah, specifically the king and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And unfortunately, while he was the Lord's mouthpiece to King Jehoiakim, he was completely rejected by the king. He also had to contend with false prophets who continued to give the city officials, the political leaders really, false hope that somehow Judah would prevail over the Babylonian Empire. Well, King Zedekiah, the final king of Judah, also rejected Jeremiah and had him thrown into a well. If it weren't for an Ethiopian servant who pleaded on his behalf, he probably would have been left to die or perish in the well, but he was eventually saved. And Jeremiah, one of the things he did was to speak out against the worship of the Canaanite goddess Asherah. This is from chapter 24 of his book. And then finally, Jeremiah, like Isaiah, prophesies that the Medes are going to become God's chosen instrument to punish Babylon. This is from Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 11. So even though God is announcing that he's using Babylon to punish Judah, God is also foretelling the means by which Babylon itself would ultimately be destroyed. The next prophet we'll look at is Ezekiel. I consider Ezekiel to be the ambassador to the exiles. So Ezekiel was taken into Babylonian captivity in 597, and he lived among the exiles near the Kebar River in Babylonia. And the exiles there for a time were kind of holding out hope that Judah would somehow prevail against the Babylonian Empire, defeat Babylon, and then the people that were taken into captivity would be able to return to Jerusalem or to Judah. Well, Ezekiel receives a special vision in Ezekiel chapter 8, as recorded, and he observes the detestable things that are occurring in Jerusalem, including turning to the practices of foreign gods in the hopes that they would be delivered. You see, while all this assault from Babylon is going on, the people are not only rejecting the word of the true prophets like Jeremiah, but they're praying to the gods of the other nations in the hopes that somehow these gods would deliver them from Babylon. In the 12th year of exile, a man who fled Jerusalem proclaims to the exiles that the city has fallen. This is from Ezekiel 33, verse 21, and this dashes all hopes of the captives in Babylonia that they would be able to return to Judah. Well, Ezekiel offers assurance that though the Jews have been scattered, they will return to their land. So there's a promise of restoration in Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 17. The third and final prophet we're going to look at is Daniel. Daniel, I consider him to be the ambassador to Babylon. So he was taken into Babylonian captivity along with the exiles in 605 BC. This is 2 years after Nebuchadnezzar, really for all intents and purposes, becomes the ruler over the nation of Judah. The people began to serve Judah, or rather the people of Judah began to serve Babylon in the year 607 BC. So now 2 years later, a bunch of captives are taken into Babylon. Now Nebuchadnezzar selects Daniel from among the exiles who he saw were wise and skilled in understanding. So Daniel goes on to be a person of high status within the Babylonian government. Daniel's name is changed to Belteshazzar, and he's given special wisdom and insight by God to interpret the dreams of various kings of Babylon, as we'll see. So Daniel interprets the dream of Nebuchadnezzar and tells him that he would be punished because he was proud and did not acknowledge God. This is from Daniel 4:26. So we can see that God is using Daniel to preserve the Israelites by showing the kings of Babylon that the God of Daniel is the true living God. So a very important point. Daniel also prophesies against King Belshazzar in his vision of the writing on the wall, and this is from Daniel chapter 5. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then, like I said, Daniel's ministry very likely influenced the Babylonian rulers in a way that resulted in better conditions for the Jewish exiles. We're going to take a slight detour here and talk about another people that are mentioned in Ezekiel, and we're going to see how this prophecy in Ezekiel relates to events directly related to the Babylonian captivity of Judah. Well, in Ezekiel 38 and 39, that's chapters 30 and 39, there's a description of these people that come from the north. And the description says that these people are ultimately defeated. Now, the modern version of the end times says something to the following, that this is really a description of modern Russia and how modern Russia is going to assault modern Israel. And I'm going to show you that these two chapters describe nothing of the sort. And I'm going to show you that these two chapters are describing an ancient nation called the Scythians. So, who were the Scythians? The ancient, so Magog, who is another name for the Scythians, were a nomadic people who were active in the Middle East from the 7th century BC until about the end of the 2nd century BC. Now, the Scythians lived in the steppes. These were grassy flatlands surrounded by mountainous regions extending from Hungary to China. The Scythians were expert horsemen and preferred a life of raiding and trade rather than building settlements. In the 8th century BC, Scythia conquered Media and replaced it as a regional power. Now, in the 7th century, a century later, Scythia and the Assyrian Empire are allies. This allows Scythia to turn its attention to Palestine for a time and the surrounding nations. Now, after invading Egypt, Scythia turns north and combines its forces with Media, invades and conquers Nineveh in 612 BC. I mentioned earlier that Babylon and Media joined forces to conquer Assyria, and that's how Nineveh fell. What I didn't mention a few slides ago was that Scythia was actually one of the nations that helped to ultimately topple the Assyrian Empire by destroying Nineveh in 612 BC. Now, in 585 BC, this is a very important point, the nation of Media crushes Scythia and drives it north to the Caucasus, which is a mountainous region between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. Why is this important? Because in 586 BC, the nation of Judah is left in ruins, and the poorest people are left in the lands. Their villages and cities are unprotected. The walls of the major cities have been destroyed. The people in 585 BC, a year after the Babylonian captivity, are completely defenseless. And it's exactly at this time that Scythia presents a threat to them, but that threat is ultimately eliminated by the nation of Media. So, Judah is taken into Babylonian captivity in 586 BC. And remember, only the poorest people are left to take care of the land, and those who are left are defenseless and invulnerable to raiding parties. Ezekiel describes a time when Scythians looked to a weakened and defenseless Israel with the intent of invading the unwalled villages. This is from Ezekiel 38, verses 10 and 11. Ezekiel describes these invaders as horsemen from the north. This is from Ezekiel 38, verse 15. Now, we know the Scythians were known to field relatively few infantry soldiers compared to riders. In other words, the Scythians were typically not looking to invade a nation and bring it under its control. They were simply looking to raid. They had raiding parties where they would attack defenseless people, carry off probably their women, cattle, gold, silver, anything else they could get their hands on. Well, Ezekiel declares that those who live in Israel will eventually gather up the weapons left behind and use them for firewood. This is from Ezekiel 39, verses 9 and 10. We know from archaeological records that there are Scythian artifacts left in the nation surrounding Israel. This attests to the fact that the Scythians were, in fact, very involved in that region in the Middle East, but ultimately, again, we know that in 585 BC, a year after the Babylonian captivity, Scythia was pushed north and they were no longer a threat to the people of Judah in fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy. Last thing we're going to look at here is the fall of Babylon. So after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon was ruled by less capable men. There's a series of kings who just did not have the leadership skills of Nebuchadnezzar. The final king was Nabonidus, who co-ruled with his son Belshazzar. So whereas Nebuchadnezzar looked into the religious affairs of the nation for practical purposes, Nabonidus was a religious fanatic who was disliked by the people. Nabonidus negates a treaty with Media and aligns the nation with Cyrus and the Persians. Well, this allows Cyrus to turn his attention to Media directly to their north. Cyrus defeats Media and absorbs Media into its nation. This is the birth of the Persian Empire. It or the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire, later on simply referred to as the Persian Empire. So now with the combined forces of Media and Persia, Cyrus the Great then turns his attention to Babylon, invades the city. Nabonidus flees the city and leaves his son Belshazzar in charge of the city. So then in 539 BC, Babylon falls to Persia, and these events are recorded in Daniel 5. And recall that Belshazzar was the Babylonian king who saw the famous writing on the wall that talked about how he and Babylon would ultimately be destroyed. So when Cyrus enters the city of Babylon, he's actually hailed as a deliverer and not as a conqueror, because by that time the people had tired of the less capable leaders of the Babylonian Empire. So now in 539 BC, for all intents and purposes, the Medo-Persian Empire is now the prevailing empire of the world, of the known world at that time. In conclusion, so let's wrap up some of the major points from this presentation. So the Chaldean dynasty of Babylon started in 625 BC when Babylon declared its independence from Assyria, and it lasted until 539 BC when Persia invades Babylon. Babylon was the Lord's instrument to punish Judah for the sins of the people that included unfaithfulness and the worship of other gods. Josiah was the last godly king of Judah. However, even though he was a righteous man, the nation was still going to be destroyed. Judah becomes a vassal state of Babylon during the reign of King Jehoiakim. Again, this is in 607 BC. The final king of Judah, who is Zedekiah, he ignores the words of the prophet Jeremiah, rebels against the king of Babylon, and ultimately in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire, completely destroys Jerusalem. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope that you join me for the next lesson, where we'll be talking about the Persian Empire. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.